Good afternoon and welcome inside the Betsy M. Ross studio inside Ball State Sports Link. This is the Cards Court, the number one weekly Ball State basketball podcast in the world. We're happy to be back here in the spring semester after our kind of Christmas hiatus. But of course, it's myself, Griffin, Leonard, and Sam Neiger. Sam, it is wonderful to be back. Another semester, we're back to our weekly schedule, and with as many MAC games as are coming up, I'm excited for it.
I am too. You know, it's always great when we get into MACtion season. You know, the calendar year has flipped, and now it's go time. It's noses to the grindstone. These two teams, Ball State men's and women's basketball, both vying for spots in the Mid-American Conference tournament. The Ball State women's team looks really sharp right now. The men seem to have turned a corner a little bit as we flip into the new year, so a lot to break down, especially since we haven't had a show in a while. I'm excited to get to it.
Let's do it. Well, we won't have a guest today, just Sam and I kind of breaking down everything that went on during the holiday break and how the conference schedule is really shaken up so far. And we'll return to our regular programming with our guests starting next week. Let's break down the schedule over the last couple of weeks, starting with men's basketball. As we know, it was a shaky start to the season, but they really started to turn it around. Going into the break, wins over Bellarmine and Evansville, and things were on a high. It was looking like Ball State was going to cruise to 6-6 going into the Mid-American Conference slate. But Anderson gave them some trouble. D3 Anderson, Cardinals got the win by 13 points, but the game is a lot closer than 13 points. But the momentum carried into MAC schedule. A huge win on the road at Kent State. Suffered a loss at home on Tuesday to Miami of Ohio by 8 points. But it's a much improved Ball State men's basketball team than what we saw in the month of November.
I couldn't agree more, Griffin, and I think the real key difference right now for this Ball State's men's team compared to what we saw in the first month or two of the season is this team's ability to win on the road. The Florida tournament was a neutral site. We don't really count that, but you're talking about two big road wins on either end caps of this four-game win streak at Bellarmine, which really kind of started. It was the catalyst for this win streak. The team finally found some momentum, finally won a close game, got the squad rolling, and then you get a huge road win in MAC play for your first game of conference play on the year against Kent State. No, I don't think Kent State is a contender in the Mid-American Conference this year by any stretch. But I think if they lose to Ball State in that fashion by almost 10 points, that might eliminate them from that conversation. But all things considered, it was an impressive win for Ball State. They beat a higher touted MAC opponent on the road. That's huge. Now, did they suffer that loss against Miami? Yes, and we'll get into more of the nitty-gritty details of that game especially, but I think that's a much better Miami team that they lost to than the Kent State team that they ended up beating. So maybe don't even hit the panic mode just yet. I think this team definitely has the capability to string together another 4, 5, or even 6-game win streak as this year continues.
Yeah, I will say I agree. I think Kent State is not an opponent to scoff at.
No,
they were picked third in the MAC preseason coaches poll. That's a team with a lot of expectations. Von Cameron Davis in his redshirt senior season, he was preseason All-MAC. That was a team that was expected to take care of business without a problem against Ball State.
Yeah.
The Cardinals come out and surprise. And it's just a Cardinal team that's playing with a lot more confidence. We'll talk about it a lot more as we continue the episode. But I want to break down the women's schedule. They had a long break after a December 19th battle against Anderson in which they put up a whopping 112 points. Got a nice little break off for the holidays. Came back on New Year's Day. Won at Miami to open up the conference slate before picking up back-to-back home wins over both Central and Eastern Michigan. So they start out 3-0 in MAC play, and the Cardinals really look like they haven't lost much of a step.
I agree, Griffin. This is not a Ball State team that has really hit any hiccups quite yet. They had kind of an off game on Saturday, January 4th against Central Michigan. They did end up winning that game by 11 points, but the free throws weren't there. The physicality in the paint wasn't there. They weren't rebounding maybe to the clip we're used to seeing this team. Brady Salley kind of chewed into him a little bit. He told it how it was at the end of that game. Whereas if they play at that level against some of these higher touted MAC opponents like the Buffaloes and the Kent States, who are on the schedule very soon, if they play like they did against Central Michigan against those opponents, that's not going to turn into as many wins as Ball State wants. Then they turned it around and scored 101 points against Eastern Michigan, left no room for doubt. They apparently have buried that Central Michigan game in their back pocket. They don't want to have a performance like that again, Griffin, and I don't blame them. This is a team that continues to roll.
Well, in a huge week coming up for Ball State women's basketball. We'll talk about it later on the show, but you talk about the couple of missteps against Central Michigan. They still get the result in the win column that they're hoping for, and then they come out against Eastern, a team that's 1-11, a team that's trying to find their identity outside of CCLACO. Really not much there in Ypsilanti. Ypsilanti comes out, and Eastern Michigan is hitting three-pointer after three-pointer after three-pointer in the first half. Ball State's still up 15, but Eastern Michigan is still in the game, and then the Cardinals come out in the second half and just shut them down. It goes to show that it takes a lot to beat this Ball State team when they're playing with confidence. Even if they're not at their best, if they're playing at a high level, it takes a top-tier performance to hang with them.
We saw maybe the best performance in terms of shooting the basketball from Eastern Michigan outside of CCLACO, who had a really off day yesterday. Most of her points came in the final 5 minutes. But we saw a great shooting day from the rest of that Eastern Michigan team. And yet Ball State still shut out Eastern Michigan through the first 6 minutes of that second half. Ball State at one point outscored Eastern Michigan 15-0 in quarter number 3. That was the run that they got out to. And that's with the fact that Eastern Michigan was playing better as a team really than we had seen all season. And Ball State still drops 101 points on them. They beat them by 32 points. No, not every opponent is just trying to find themselves to the level that Eastern Michigan is, but the way in which Ball State is playing right now on both ends of the basketball, on both ends of the floor, they are really dangerous, and it takes not only their opponents having a really good day to beat them, but it takes Ball State having an off day as well, and that's just not a combination I see happening very often.
So what I want to do is I want to take a second here. If you could just sum up Ball State women's basketball over the break and then this first week of conference play, if you could sum it up in one word, what would it be and why?
Okay, well, yes, it's going to be one word, but there's going to be hyphens between my words, okay? Business as usual. Hyphens in between
I'll give
those
it to
words.
you, yeah.
It's a team that has expectations. It's a team that's riding a 5-game win streak right now. You can't really expect any more than a 5-game win streak because their last loss was against one of the best teams in the nation right now in Ohio State. Since that Ohio State game, 5 straight wins against pretty quality opponents. Now they've got some tough games coming up right now, but when Ball State is expected to win a game, they win a game. It doesn't always have to be the prettiest. I point to that Central Michigan game, but even on off nights, this Cardinals team delivers performances that are worthy of a conference championship, Griffin.
So the question I have for you then is you look at the way the non-conference schedule shook out. I think Cardinal fans were expecting obviously some battles, which we saw, but 8-4, maybe not the record that Cardinal fans were hoping for. It seems like the Cardinals have had no problem taking care of business against teams they're supposed to, but when it comes to high-tier opponents like Columbia, like South Dakota State, I mean, obviously they're playing North Carolina, they're playing Ohio State, but those Columbia and South Dakota State games, which Ball State was right there with them pretty much the whole way, they couldn't get it done. Is that something that we should be concerned about in MAC play with matchups against Buffalo and Kent on the horizon?
I think it's not necessarily time to be concerned about it yet. If we see repeats of those games, of those types of performances against the Kent States and the Buffaloes of the world, then maybe it's time to really take a step back and assess what's going on. But for the moment, I think Ball State just ran into South Dakota State, especially at a bad time. You're coming off of a tournament that is, built on incredibly stiff competition, but is also about fun. Then you come back to Worthen Arena, you're removed from the Bahamas, you're removed from that quote-unquote fun environment. Yes, we love playing at Worthen Arena. Yes, it's fun, but it's no Nassau. With that in mind, they ran into a really good team who was really hot, coming off of a ranked win against Oregon. Ball State had already worn themselves out in 3 games in 3 days, losing 2 of them to 2 tournament teams in North Carolina and Columbia. All of a sudden, you get to a point where you just knew they were going to get kicked in the teeth at some point. I'm just glad that it happened so early in the season so that now that we do have these tough back-to-back conference opponents in Kent State and Buffalo. The Cards seem prepared for it. If they're able to get the job done, even in just one of two, I'd love to see them win both. I think they're very capable of winning both. But if they win one of two, I don't think there's cause for concern about how this team plays in games where it's not as heavily favored as some of the Eastern Michigans or the Central Michigans of the world.
So there's no doubt the Cardinals can play well against some of these big teams. It's just about finding that signature win.
I couldn't agree more, Griff. I think that's pretty much hitting the nail on the head at this point.
All right, well, we went through that for the women's team. I'll do the same for the men's team. A lot to kind of break down. You look at the 4-game win streak that really kind of came out of nowhere after a 3-6 start to the season, in which the Cardinals had only beaten one Division I school. And I think the word that kind of comes out of it is just kind of confusion, but in a good way.
Sure.
I think that you have a win against Bellarmine. That was a hard-fought win on the road. And then they just blow out Evansville, a team that beat them last season. And the Cardinals were favored in that game, but 37 points? I don't think anybody really saw that coming.
No.
Then you almost lose to a Division III school in Anderson. You start MAC play and you beat one of the best in the conference. Like, it's just, it's fun to watch, and I think we're seeing Ball State really start to find their groove. But to say that it was expected, I can't say it was really confusing to watch.
It was, Griffin, and I hear your points. And although it is confusion in a good way, and I could not agree more with you on that, confusion reflects a lack of identity, for better or for worse. And I think this is a Ball State team that, although has been on a nice streak as of late, lacks some identity. I want to know your perspective, especially. Where does this team find its identity, and how does it do so? I think it just comes down to confidence. Michael Lewis is a coach that is going to expect the best out of his players every single minute of every single game. And when the losses keep filtering in, it's difficult to build that confidence. And we see that with the way that Ethan Britton-Watts started the season, the way that Jeremiah Hernandez started the season. They just couldn't find that confidence. Now the wins are rolling in, and look who's starting to show up. We're finally seeing what the Cardinals are capable of. I still think there's a lot more to be desired from guys like Britton-Watts and guys like Jeremiah Hernandez. Still, guys like Mason Jones haven't really found their footing on the offensive side, but Ball State is playing like a team now. Yeah. And Wanzi Gorosito, he had an off day on Tuesday. The Cardinals probably could have used a few made shots down the stretch in that game, but you're seeing the guys on the floor starting to play together, and that's a really powerful thing in the MAC play. And along with that Wanzi Gorosito point, yes, a couple of made threes definitely would have given the Cardinals the boost they needed, but I think they lost to a top 3 team in the Mid-American Conference in Miami. Maybe flip-flop the expectations of Miami and Kent State, because this Cade Kraft kid from Miami dropping 28 points. I had the pleasure of doing sideline in that game, and I got to interview Coach Steele post game. I said, "What kind of a threat does Kraft pose to the rest of the conference?" And he said out and out, this kid is the best scorer in the Mid-American Conference, and I'm inclined to agree with him on that. So with that in mind, I think Ball State lost to a really quality opponent in Miami. What's going to be very interesting over the next couple of weeks are games against Bowling Green, Ohio, and Toledo. I know we'll dive into that, but Bowling Green is a really winnable game. Ohio and Toledo, those could pose some real threats. But if Ball State is able to win with consistency against teams that have similar records to them, I think it puts the Cards in a good spot.
So I guess where should Ball State men's basketball fans feel that the Cardinals really stand in the conference? Because you get a big win on the road against Kent, you lose to Miami at home in the home opener, and if you can't get things done against Bowling Green, then you're looking at a situation where you could very easily be 1-4 in the MAC. But I feel like if they were, that wouldn't be consistent with where the Cardinals really are at this point.
Here's the bottom line, Griffin. Your word for Ball State's performance over the break was confusion. That's where every MAC team is at right now. We're 2 to 3 games into Mid-American Conference play. Nobody can tell who the best team in the conference is. Yeah, maybe you had Kent State pegged pretty high. That was until they lost to Ball State at home to open conference play. There's just so many unanswered questions, not even from a Ball State perspective. This is a league that is talented with a lot of parity. Ball State could finish as high as I could see them finishing as high as 5 or 6. I could see them dropping as low as not making the Mid-American Conference tournament. And you could say that about maybe 8 teams in this conference. That's an unbelievable thing to say and not something we see at the Division I level a lot. With that in mind, I think it's okay to not have answers yet. Give it a week, give it 2 weeks even, and then we can reassess just how we should feel as Ball State fans.
Well, that's the thing, because there is a long way to go.
Yeah.
It feels like we've been at this for a while, and it's because the season started 2 months ago now, but the real thick of things is just starting to churn, just starting to get going. There's a lot to continue to break down and a lot to look forward to, but I feel like both teams are in a pretty good spot.
I couldn't agree more, Griff. I can't wait to see what these two teams do from this point on.
Well, so we've got up to where we are now. The questions still to be answered are where do these teams go next? We'll answer that after the break, and we'll get you ready for the rest of the Mid-American Conference schedule. This is the Cards Court, presented by Victory Honda of Muncie. Griffin, Leonard, Sam, Neiger. We'll be right back.
Victory Honda of Muncie. We're not just another car dealership, and here's why. We stand behind every car we sell and are dedicated to helping our customers save time and money. All our pre-owned cars undergo a rigorous 182-point inspection and come with a 90-day warranty to ensure that you're getting a Victory quality vehicle. Plus, you'll get 2 years of complimentary oil changes and tire rotations. We're part of a top 15 dealership group and have an enormous selection of vehicles with access to inventory at over 45 locations. You always get more for your trade and the best possible rates with us. We have an excellent relationship with hundreds of lenders. Our exclusive Car Doc maintenance and membership program will help you save hundreds of dollars in the process of maintaining your vehicle. Lastly, our state-of-the-art body shop and certified technicians perform high-quality repairs and paintwork on most vehicle makes and models. Victory Honda of Muncie. We're not just another car dealership.
Welcome back here to the Cards Court, presented by Victory Honda of Muncie. Big thanks to Victory Honda of Muncie for sponsoring SportsLink. As always, we're back here, Griffin, Leonard, Sam, Neiger, for the back half of our show this afternoon. And Sam, we talked about what has been during the break. Now let's talk about what hopefully will be as we break down the upcoming schedule for this week, a telling week in all likelihood for both sides. Starting with the men's team, they host the Bowling Green Falcons on Saturday at 2 p.m. right here at Worthen Arena. You can catch that game on SL Digital Radio if you can't be here in person. And then the men's Cards will head out to Athens, Ohio for a showdown with the Bobcats Tuesday at 7 p.m. on ESPN+. And then for the women's team, it is a huge week. Can't underemphasize that fact. The Cardinals have a couple of teams chasing them in the early slate of the MAC, and 2 of them are on the schedule right here. It's the Buffalo Bulls. They go at Buffalo to New York. That's a long road trip on Saturday, but should be a pretty good game against a Buffalo team with a lot of confidence. And then they go to Kent State Wednesday night at 7 at Kent, Ohio. 2 road games, 2 good games, at least hopefully, and a lot to be excited for in the next 7 days on both sides.
I think so, Griff. And for both of these teams, obviously at different points in their seasons right now, with different expectations going up against some of the top opponents in the Mid-American Conference on both sides. But I think some very winnable games for the men's side as well. And it seems like every time the Ball State women come out to play, they're expected to win. They're expected to have a good performance and at least be competitive with every other good team in the Mid-American Conference.
So let's start with Ball State men's basketball. They were on a 4-game win streak. They lose at home to Miami of Ohio in front of a good crowd, which I expect to come back on Saturday. But it feels like for the Cardinals, after a really, really impressive win to start the conference slate, you need a win with a couple of really tough games on the horizon.
And I think this game perhaps is going to define Ball State for the coming weeks. I don't think you can expect a win on the road at Ohio later in the week, knowing that they are the preseason MAC favorites, knowing that they've played very well in each of their MAC games up to this point. But Bowling Green is a team that's 7-7 on the year. I have their schedule pulled up in front of me. They are 1-2 in the MAC, so they've played 3 conference games. Ball State currently sits at 1-1. So these are two teams that on paper look pretty similar. Both teams are faced with that, token confusion we've seen out of the Mid-American Conference that we were talking about earlier. So for Ball State, the opportunity is there. You have a chance to prove that Kent State win was not a fluke, that Miami loss was not a fluke, that you can assert yourself as one of those teams who has a legitimate spot, not just to get a MAC tournament seeding, but to maybe even push for one of the top seeds in the Mid-American Conference. If they're able to beat some of these mid-level MAC teams, it sets them in apart to be able to put themselves in a great spot where other teams are chasing them in the back half of the season rather than the other way around.
Well, and I'll tell you one other thing. You look at from the women's perspective. We've been talking Worthen Arena. Oh, it's a fortress. It's a tough place to play.
It is.
That hasn't necessarily been the case for Ball State men's basketball over the last season or two. They have an opportunity as the conference slate really gets going to reestablish that. They couldn't do so against Miami, even though they were able to keep that game close. But if you can beat Bowling Green, you've got a really cool matchup versus Toledo a week from Saturday, which should bring out another good crowd.
Yeah.
You look at the attendance numbers, and the Cardinals are right up there. Yeah. There's no reason that the product on the court can't match the atmosphere in the arena if they can continue to build up that home court advantage. That can also become incredibly powerful as the season goes on.
Atmosphere and culture correlate in my mind, Griffin. And I don't think Ball State has a bad culture at all. But I do think that this men's team has not necessarily established a culture of being definitive winners at home yet. And that goes back to last season as well. Some close losses, some gut-wrenching defeats. I think of the Western Michigan game. I think of overtime losses against Miami and Ohio. I mean, this is a Ball State team that really went through the whole roller coaster last year at home in Worthen Arena. And it maybe wasn't as appealing to fans this year, knowing that Ball State lost so many close games at home last year. If they're able to go out and win a thriller against Bowling Green, because I do expect it to be close, if Ball State gets a close win against Bowling Green, that lifts the culture, and elevating with that culture will be the atmosphere inside Worthen Arena. Yes, they've got the attendance numbers that really raise some eyebrows, but when you've got such an expansive arena as Worthen, there's some empty space regardless. So as much empty space as you can fill is going to be a great sign for Ball State moving forward.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you one thing the Cardinals have struggled with in years past is getting the fans to stay throughout the entire season.
Yeah.
You look at the schedule. You have 3 more home games in the month of January. You have 5 and a 6th in the early month of March. You have 5 February home games. That
Crazy.
Down the stretch, the home court advantage may be crucial. You've got to make the fans care now, or you might lose them near the end game, and I think that's imperative.
I absolutely think you might be right there, Griffin. Especially
couldn't agree more.
I couldn't agree more. There's 3 games in a row at home in early February, including the MAC Sun Belt Challenge. I think that string of games could define Ball State as a team this season.
And that has the opportunity to be 3 winnable games with Eastern Michigan and NIU, and who knows, we haven't gotten that Sun Belt opponent yet,
right.
But normally they try to match them up, and depending on where Ball State is in the standings, they should get an opponent that's a relatively even matchup, and therefore a pretty winnable game. Let's cycle over toward the women's side, because there's 2 massive games coming up here. Tons of star power on the other side in both Buffalo and Kent State. Just powerhouses for what we should expect toward the end of the season. Kind of a shame, honestly, that the matchups come so early in conference play, but that just goes to show there's no dull moments in the Mid-American Conference.
Although I would rather have both of these games on the road now, knowing that both of these opponents are on the schedule later in the year in Worthen Arena. Ball State plays Kent State late in February, and then in their second to last game of the season at home against Buffalo on March 5th. That's going to be another huge one as well. That could ultimately come down to the number 1 seed in the MAC tournament if things shake out right. But in terms of what's actually going down this week, I do want to make a really crucial point. Yes, these are two tough road environments, but it's also two tough road trips. Both of these games are separate road trips, so it's split apart for the team. So they've got to travel pretty significant distances for Mid-American Conference games twice in 1 week. They're actually chartering a flight for that game to Buffalo. That's the only time Ball State will charter a flight this season for a MAC game, is the game against Buffalo. So that makes it a little bit easier, but it's still quite a distance from home. I think a significant difference between Buffalo and Kent State is that they are going to bus over to Kent State. That's a ways away from here in Muncie. You got to get all the way up into Northeast Ohio, all the way like you're heading over to Pennsylvania or even back over towards the Buffalo, New York area. So that's something to keep an eye on. Can this team travel well? They proved that, yes, they can when they're in the Bahamas, but it's hard not to maintain a good mentality when you're in Nassau. My concern is that this team might not have faced a travel week like this yet against two really tough conference opponents. I think Ball State's going to be up to the task, but I think the travel could play a significant factor in these two in this week's two matchups.
So, one question I had for you. We talked about it earlier. Ball State shut down Eastern Michigan largely because they shut down CC Aleko. The rest of her team stepped up. But it was too much to really handle without their star at their best. You look at these two teams in Kent State and Buffalo, I think it's pretty safe to say they're two teams that are much more well-rounded.
Yeah.
But the star power still exists. Chella Watson, an incredible player at Buffalo. Jenna Batch for Kent State, senior leader.
Yep.
Both of them expected to play crucial roles in these upcoming games, and the question I'll ask you is, the Cardinals were able to shut down Aleko. Will they be able to shut down Watson and Batch as efficiently? And if they are, will they be able to overcome the rest of those rosters the same way they did against EMU?
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to jump too far ahead into my bold prediction, because my bold prediction for the women's team does surround Chella Watson, but I will say this. Allie Becky is likely to guard Chella Watson one-on-one. Both of them are guards. That's the top two players right now in the Mid-American Conference vying for MAC Player of the Year. I think Ball State has the ability to shut down Buffalo because they know they can shut down one-trick ponies. They proved it against CC Aleko and Eastern Michigan. Are we going to see the traditional defense we're used to seeing from Ball State when they're playing a more well-rounded team? Probably not. Brady Sally knows how to adjust defensive game plans to match these one-trick ponies. Those are his words, not mine. For Kent State, I think there's a different challenge because they are more well-rounded than Buffalo. Yes, they're led by Bash, but she can have an off night, and the rest of the roster can step up and take her place. I don't know if that's the case for Buffalo, but I think that's what makes Kent State more dangerous. And I think the fact that both Ball State and Kent State have such deep, well-rounded rosters makes them the two most prominent teams in the conference at this point. And I think that's why you saw Kent State take care of Buffalo in the first game of MAC play. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not the star power is even a threat for Kent State, or if they're going to be able to distribute the scoring out. I think they will be able to, Griff.
Absolutely. One thing I'll mention, Ball State played Buffalo last year in Worthen Arena.
Yeah.
It was a matchup that the Cardinals were expected to win without much of a problem.
Yeah.
Chella Watson came out in that first quarter, and I want to say she had 18.
She did.
At the first quarter's break, the Buffalo led 27-9. The Cardinals had to fight back into it, won the game despite Watson's 28 points. But she is a game changer, and it's something the Cardinals will undoubtedly have to watch for as that matchup starts up. And we'll get to bold predictions now. I know you kind of teased us there. Let's start with you for women's basketball in this crucial week. What do you got?
Well, Chella Watson averages 19.7 points per game. Round up, call it 20 points per game. I think Ball State, with the way they handled CC Aleko on Wednesday against Eastern Michigan, which was yesterday compared to the day that we're actually filming our show. With that in mind, yes, Buffalo is a much better team than Eastern Michigan, but I think Ball State, my bold prediction, holds Chella Watson to 12 or less points. If they're able to do that the way they were able to shut down CC Aleko, not only does that assert Allie Becky as the front runner for MAC Player of the Year, but it also is going to afford Ball State essentially a much easier path to winning that game on the road. So Chella Watson, less than 12 points, the Ball State defense is going to shine. That's my women's bold prediction.
Absolutely. And on my side, I'll say I think depending on how the Buffalo game goes, I think that just naturally kind of affects the Wednesday game against Kent State.
I agree.
And I think that long road trip, charter flight or not, it may affect things as well. You have 3 days in between games, a chance to recover. I guess 4 if you count the long day Wednesday before the match actually tips off. But for me, I think the biggest thing to note is the travel. It's the confidence that Buffalo still holds despite their loss. And for my bold prediction, I'm going to say Buffalo gives the Cardinals a better challenge than Kent State in this game.
Wow.
I think if the Cardinals are able to take care of the Buffalo Bulls in a close game, they're going to be on such a confidence high that Kent State game just almost comes naturally. I think Ball State have the better matchups against a Kent State team that I think is naturally a little bit more well-rounded, which sometimes that can be a little helpful for an opponent because you know that one person isn't necessarily going to take over the stage, take over the game, and become unstoppable. That's the threat that Buffalo poses. And if you're right, if Watson isn't on, it could be a long day in Buffalo for the Bulls. But if she is, it's going to be a tough game. I think Kent State, while they have more options, I think the Cardinals overall have the ability to suffocate the Golden Flashes on both ends.
I have a feeling, Griffin, that only one of our 2 predictions is coming true because that does kind of lend itself to 2 very different games. I think both are well within the realm of possibility. This is a good Buffalo team that can certainly give the Cardinals a run for their money, especially if Watson plays how we know she can.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think our predictions are on the opposite end of the spectrum there, so I would be surprised if they managed to both work
Right,
out.
exactly.
On the men's basketball side, I think it's important to look at a couple things. I'll let you start here. A couple of games, Bowling Green, Ohio. Are you going with one that wraps both games into one, or are you just focusing on the one matchup?
I think I'm just going to focus on this Bowling Green matchup, and I'll tell you why. First of all, we already talked about the confusion on the men's side right now in the Mid-American Conference. Nobody can seem to assert themselves except for Ohio. Ohio is the upper echelon of MAC basketball right now, and then there's kind of everybody else. So with that in mind, I don't know how bold I can really go in that Ohio game. The Bobcats are going to be favored to beat Ball State in that game. But with as much confusion as there is in the rest of the league, just about any prediction you make can be bold. So I'm going to make a bold prediction. I think Ball State gets a double-digit win against Bowling Green at home. That is asking a lot, but this team is starting to gel. If Wanzi Gorosito doesn't have 0 points against Miami, if he hits 2 threes, which is not asking a lot from him, that's a 2-point loss for Ball State. That's a much different game than the final score we saw against Miami. What, you foul down the stretch, maybe the Red Hawks miss a couple of free throws, suddenly Ball State has an opportunity to win the game. I think Ball State, from top to bottom, all 5 starters and then those 3 players that typically play off the bench are going to have a really good day. I think they're going to shore up the things that didn't work against Miami. I know they've been putting in work. I think they're going to be able to turn that into a double-digit win at home and really cement themselves as, hey, we are one of the better teams in the MAC. That win against Kent State was not a fluke, and Worthen Arena is a tough place to play.
I like it. I'll keep things sort of similar because this Bowling Green game is crucial, right?
It is.
And what you said about Wanzi Gorosito is right on the money. If he was active and alive in that Miami game, it's just a different result because you had the rest of the team that was playing, maybe not at their best, but at a pretty high level. But the one thing they lacked down the stretch was the ability to hit a big shot. That was not there. The Cardinals have not found somebody outside of Wanzi Gorosito that is capable of hitting the big 3 ball down the stretch in the clutch.
Yeah.
If they get Gorosito back in big moments like that, the Cardinals win those games.
Yeah.
That was a big struggle they had last year finishing games. They did that against Kent State. They had the opportunity to do that, against Miami, but the shots weren't falling, and they never had that late game scenario to really flex their muscles and go win the ball game. I think that changes at Bowling Green. I think Wanzi comes back strong, and I tab him for 5 3-pointers against Bowling Green to have a big comeback game, make up for what they didn't have against the Red Hawks, and solidify himself as the Cardinals sharpshooter.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. That would be phenomenal. And that both of our predictions on the men's side could definitely come true.
Absolutely, and I'll add one thing as we start to wrap up here for Ohio. The other thing the Cardinals struggled with against Miami was defense. In the second half, they had multiple times they got the game down to 2, 3, 4 points. They needed a big defensive stop, and they couldn't get it. It was just a simple back cut on the baseline where the defensive presence wasn't there. The help defense didn't come in time. Ohio loves to exploit that. They love to play fast. If the Cardinals aren't working on that in practice right now, it's going to be a long day in Athens, but I'm confident that they're going to look at the film, make the adjustments necessary, and give the Bobcats a good game.
I think that's probably about what Michael Lewis is trying to preach to his team right now. They knew Miami was a good three-point shooting team, so they decided to push the defense out, play the Red Hawks a little higher up. Yeah, it exposed that backdoor cut. I think finding that right balance is going to be key for the Cardinals when they do face OU.
Well, Sam, we've had a pretty good conversation today. There was a lot to break down with a big week ahead and a lot to keep talking about as the season goes on. We hope you've enjoyed listening to us for about 35 minutes at this point. We'll be back at our normal schedule with guests starting next week. We hope to see you at Worthen Arena, and we hope that you enjoy this week's slate of Ball State basketball. This has been the Cards Court, presented by Victory Honda of Muncie at the Betsy M. Ross Studios. Here in SportsLink, Griffin, Leonard, Sam Neiger saying so long. We'll see you next week.